An important edition of The Other Side this week as we explore the terrifying truth about how we manage COVID. We blew it. Big time. I'm joined for a podcast-length deep dive interview with Australian National University Professor Dr. Ramesh Thakur on the things that we simply must learn from Australia's serious COVID mismanagement. It's not possibly then the vaccination that's causing the excess deaths or all of them. We know out of that 15,000, about 9,000 can be explained. There's a little margin of error, but you're still talking about 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 deaths that we cannot explain. Yeah. That's an extraordinary number.
It is. So what we need to do is put aside preconceptions from all sides.
Yeah.
And look at this seriously. You know, at the time we said from an abundance of caution, we're going to do this because even one avoidable death is one death too many. Well, okay, now we have 15,000. So what is the mix of causes and effects that are producing this? Why are we so, why do we lack any curiosity about finding out what's driving that and what we can do about it?
G'day Cairns, g'day Melbourne and g'day Australia. This is episode 307 of The Other Side for the weekend commencing Friday night, April 5, 2024. I'm Damian. Our interview with Dr. Ramesh Thakur is coming up in a moment, so stay tuned. But first, Samantha Mostyn is going to be our new Governor-General. These appointments are not supposed to be political, and she has been endorsed by both the Labor and the Liberal parties, but who is she exactly? Well, she's got some pretty strong politics, and they're pretty much on the left-wing identity politics side of things. In a tweet a couple of years ago, she wrote this: "This 26th of January, NITV sunrise ceremony simulcast on SBS and 10, cleansing ceremonies, 80,000 years of Australian history, wonderful panel discussing survival, truth, invasion day, and the future." Now, I've got a bit of a problem with that, and this is why the GG should probably be elected by the people, not appointed by the political elite. These views, as the voice vote showed, do not reflect the views of the majority of Australians. And the idea of having someone representing the King who thinks January 26 was Invasion Day is problematic to say the least, and a lot more than just a Republican. Samantha Mostyn worked for the Labor government in the 1990s under two ministers and then for Prime Minister Paul Keating. She also has quite left-leaning views on women's issues and climate change. And a year ago, she was appointed as chair of one of the country's largest industry super funds, the $160 billion Aware Super Fund. Now, she'll have to give that job up now, but it is funny, isn't it, how the industry super fund sector, a sector which invests the money taken from citizens by force by the government and shoved into savings, whether you like it or not, has become so very, very aligned with Labor and the unions and steers politics within corporations because of its massive investing clout. ESG and DEI, anyone? Who are the other heads of our industry super funds that control $1.4 trillion of your money and where it gets invested? Let's see. Well, there's ALP President and former Treasurer Wayne Swan. He's chair of the $85 billion Construction Industry Fund, CBUS. Then there's the former ACTU heavyweight and Labor Government Minister Greg Combet, or however you pronounce it. He was chair of the Industry Super Australia Fund until, I think, last year. Then Ilana Rubin, another former ACTU person, was chair of Australian Super from, I think, 2007 till about 2013. And now she's head of that super fund bank, me. Now, there's absolutely no wrongdoing here, and we are not implying any. It's just important to note how much power, the power of capital as well as Labor, now lies with politically left-aligned people in Australia. Normally in a country, the left has the power of Labor and the right has the power of capital, and there's kind of a balance, but no, not in Australia. The Brittany, Higgins, Bruce Lehrmann story took some unusual turns over the past week. The coverage of the story from The Australian has been excellent and thorough, so I do urge you to check that out. It just gets more and more complicated, and it isn't going to end anytime soon, it seems. Every inquiry and court case seems to just give birth to more inquiries and court cases. And most of you are sick to death of it all, I know. The thing is this, there are now so many tentacles to how this is all played out that the way it's played out has become a story in and of itself. A metaphor, if you like, as to how litigious our society has actually become, how blame-focused we are, how politicised some of our judicial process has become, and how dodgy commercial television news and current affairs is. But we already knew that last bit already. All I'm going to say about it is this. It might be time that we took a look at how our culture is declining, not in a four corners, ooh, look at the awful culture in Canberra, isn't it terrible, holier than thou kind of way, because this extends far beyond the out-of-touch bureaucratic bubble that is our national capital. And not in a, oh, look at how murky our legal and judicial and political system has become kind of way, because this extends far beyond just the legal and political professions. I reckon we need to look at this in a what the heck has happened to our culture and to us kind of way. Of all the coverage of Bruce Lehrmann's defamation trial that I've read in the past week, this bit stood out to me more than anything. It comes from the Tuesday hearing by Justice Lee into whether he should reopen the defamation case in light of the new evidence that came from that former Channel 7 Spotlight producer. The reopening was being pushed, of course, by Channel 10's lawyers as part of their defence. Matthew Richardson, the barrister representing Bruce Lehrmann, was arguing why Justice Michael Lee should not reopen the defamation case and consider any new evidence. Richardson said, "This is an allegation about an applicant providing documents to the media and lying about it. That's the substance of what's being argued." Justice Michael Lee said, well, it's a bit more than that. It's also not playing with a straight bat in answering questions in this defamation case. Richardson said, "It's correct, that's exactly right, Your Honour. That's what it comes back to. And just to be clear, obviously a lie under oath is an exceptionally serious matter. It's just that in this case, both the principal witnesses are alleged by both sides to have told dozens of lies under oath. That is an inescapable fact, and one which Your Honour has remarked upon." The judge said he needed to consider whether sunlight was the best disinfectant. Well, Justice Lee, as we now know, did decide that sunlight was the best disinfectant and reopened the trial. Now, I think it's still legal in Australia to speak publicly and make general comments about the behaviour of people in our society generally. Once upon a time, not so long ago, it would have been pretty serious and unthinkable to lie to a court under oath. It wouldn't be something that people did lightly or that people took lightly. But then it also would have been unthinkable to rock up to work after a drunken night out, especially if that workplace was somewhere as important as our nation's parliament, either as a man wanting to go back to catch up on some work and have a glass of whiskey or something, or as a woman wanting to just crash out on the boss's couch rather than do the responsible adult thing and go home. Once upon a time we had a sense of personal responsibility. But we've abandoned the idea of personal responsibility for a culture of blame and legalistic enforcement of blame, of everyone being a victim somehow and the winner being the most victimised. This is not about the political or legal or bureaucrat class. It's about all of us, especially us older men in society whose job used to be to play the fathering role and set a good example before the new really radical kind of feminism told us that all our masculine traits were toxic and the doofus dad became the star character in almost every TV commercial. Men need to get back to fathering. We need to clean up our own acts first and set an example. Walk the talk for the kids. No more trying to be cool dad. If you're doing drugs and getting drunk and partying with hookers, it's time for some self-reflection and spiritual and moral self-work. But all the defamation laws, sexual conduct laws, courts and rules and regulations and HR DEI nonsense isn't going to fix the stench in our culture, folks. Only we can. Every single Aussie of good character saying, hey, you know what? The lefties were wrong. Having good character and being a good person actually are a thing. Progressive moral relativism is actually a load of BS. There is a right and a wrong way to behave. There are good and bad choices in life. And we all need to clean up our acts And in case some of you think I'm sounding too preachy again, let me just say I'm a big sinner too. None of us can be perfect in this world, except the bloke who rose from the dead, of course. The point is, are we trying every day to be a better person than the day before? Do we even aim for that still? And are we setting the right example for young women and young men about what makes a decent human being and good behaviour and what doesn't? Are we parenting? Are we mentoring? We have the idea that as long as nobody's hurting anyone else, it's cool and okay to do whatever you want. Well, I get that. I lean a little to the libertarian side myself, and I don't want priests and politicians forcing me to act as they see fit. That doesn't mean anything goes. And you have to consider the long-term, non-immediate hurt and pain that your actions might cause people later on. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't strive to be moral and good character ourselves and behave with some class and dignity, even if the state or the church can't punish us for immoral behaviour in a liberal free society, as they certainly should not be allowed to, ever. But we need to find our sense of good character and morals again somehow. We need to be grown-up adults with personal responsibility to keep a free society. Because if we don't fix this on the individual level, we are never going to fix society. Society is just the sum of individuals within it and the standards that they live by. It was a shameful period in Australia's history. Citizens were placed under virtual house arrest by state governments using extraordinary powers that were highly legally questionable. People were forced to leave their jobs just for refusing to be injected with a vaccine that hadn't been fully tested yet. Citizens were denied the right to leave their country. And worst of all, citizens were denied the right to return home, rendering our most sacred national document, the Australian passport, a powerless scrap of paper. The COVID years are now behind us, but as we recover from the trauma, many experts are saying that we simply must have a thorough, wide and deep inquiry into how we handled things and what went wrong, because a lot did. A new study from Lund University in Sweden shows that the light touch approach to lockdowns taken by Swedish authorities during the COVID crisis was actually right, despite early criticism. In this important podcast-length interview, pre-recorded for this week's episode of The Other Side, I'm joined by Australian National University Professor Ramesh Thakur. Dr. Thakur is Emeritus Professor in the Crawford School of Public Policy at the ANU. He's a Fellow of the Australian Institute of International Affairs and the Brownstone Institute. And he was previously the Senior Vice Rector of the United Nations University and an Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations. We'll break the discussion into segments throughout tonight's show for you. Dr. Thakur started by telling me that Australia must learn from the more moderate response of the Swedes because it greatly reduced excess mortalities, other health problems, and economic damage. Ramesh, thank you very, very much for your time. It's great to have you on the other side.
It's good to be back, Damian.
Yeah, we've had you before, but not in the flesh, not in real life, in real time. So it's good to have you here. That was a wonderful speech at the Brownstone Institute last year, which we played a significant amount of in an earlier episode. But I just want to talk to you about this recent article that you've written for The Spectator a couple of weeks back. You were talking about a new study and 3 news reports that had come out. So to just bring us up to speed on where things are at in terms of the analysis post-COVID crisis that we're doing now and what we've learned and how much people are taking away from it all. The first thing was this academic study that highlighted this continuing confusion over the gravity of the COVID threat. Just explain that study to us and what it was all about. That's involves Sweden. Yep.
The study is by 2 professors from Lund University in Sweden, which is just north of Copenhagen. In the early months of 2020, when Sweden held out, and essentially the equivalent of their chief medical officer, Anders Tegnell, the state epidemiologist, he said, look, we have the existing plans, we have the previous studies, we've looked at what the countries are doing, and we understand neither the historical nor the scientific basis for that. So we will stay with the existing plans, which is a light touch. We give as reliable and accurate information and up-to-date information as we have to the citizens, give our recommendations, but we are not going to require shutdowns or any other thing that's mandatory. And they stayed with that. They were criticized very heavily as their death rates uh, spiked in the early months. But then, as that fell and it became clear by the mid 21 at the very latest, if not earlier, that in fact Sweden was doing quite well. It was not suffering excess deaths compared to the European averages and its neighboring countries. And its economic impacts were going to be a lot more moderate because their policies were more restrained. And then the
I
press
sort of
tells
remember
out,
that. I
don't
remember
be.
that criticism, Ramesh, early on when people were saying, "Oh no, Sweden's taken the wrong path.
Exactly.
Look at the number of deaths that they've got," and people were saying it about the United States as well. But
And Florida in particular. Yep.
didn't they suffer a higher mortality rate at the time?
No, this is the curious thing. So now, and remember, Tegnell said at the time that give us 1 to 2 years before we look at the results in comparison to other countries.
Wow.
Sweden now has just about the lowest excess mortality rate in all of the OECD, and very, very obviously very low in Europe. So these two people looked at two things. They looked at the health outcomes, in particular measuring all-cause mortality, which is the one measure that is impossible to game and manipulate. And then they looked at the longer term non-health outcomes, at least non-COVID related health outcomes. So they did look at other health and at mental health and at educational, social outcomes. And the conclusion is that on excess mortality, Sweden is at one of the lowest ends in terms of damage to your economy and other collateral harms, shall we say. Again, Sweden performs very well compared to the others. So
Wow.
the benefits of lockdowns were at best negligible. The long-term harms on the health side in terms of deferred screenings of essential tests that are used to detect critical conditions in time when they are treatable as opposed to later when they're not. The fear that was promulgated by most countries, as a result of which people thought it's too scary to go into hospital, I don't want to go, I might catch an infection there. Or they thought, on the positive side, they are overstressed and it'd be better if I don't go, let other people with COVID go. So now those are showing up, particularly in relation to cancers and diabetes and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Uh, so the benefits were negligible of the measures, and the benefits of a moderate restraint policy on the economic side. What has happened is that instead of an employment creating scheme, those have turned into a welfare crisis, as we see with ballooning debt, including in Australia.
Yeah, it was basically like, we had one problem. It was the old story of, everything looks like a nail to a man with a hammer. The
Well,
governments did
I
not
think it was
take.
worse than that, Damian. I
Yep.
think what happened was we turned our entire health service into a COVID health service.
Yes.
Then we turned entire public policy into COVID policy. That was
Yes.
absolute madness.
And we ran all these countries based on one number, one metric, which was a very, very poor, statistically poor number to run it on. We didn't even know what
Well,
the real numbers were. The numbers were terrible.
and we used wild assumptions in the models, and models were taken as science. Modeling was taken as scientific research. Model scenarios were taken as hard data, and it was all garbage in, garbage out phenomenon. So yes, we should have stuck to. We actually had hard data that we ignored.
I
The
didn't know.
Diamond Cruise, the cruise ship, the Diamond Princess,
Yes.
and the two warships, the Theodore Roosevelt in the US Navy and the
Right.
Charles de Gaulle in the French Navy. And at two ends of the spectrum in terms of age, you had the elderly living in confined quarters before the world becomes aware of COVID and people got infected. And the infection and mortality rate were nowhere near the Spanish flu. They were at the bad end of a bad flu season. With the Roosevelt and the Charles de Gaulle, you had very, very, very low mortality. So it confirmed that it's an age-related thing.
Wow.
Even for the elderly, it is not as bad as the Spanish flu. And we should always have focused on the most vulnerable, which was the 65 and over, particularly with critical underlying conditions. So the
Wow.
Great Barrington Declaration is 100% vindicated by now.
Yeah. I never thought of it like that. You've got the perfect sample. You've got
Absolutely.
a ship with elderly people on it, a cruise ship, and then you've got a perfect control group. You've got these military ships that have got young people on them only.
And healthy young people, yep.
And you can compare directly. So first of all, on the ship with the elderly, as you're saying, the mortality wasn't as high as you would have thought if we were meant to be that worried about it overall.
And then on the younger ships, like 14 people out of the 3,000, 4,000 times.
Yeah. And then in close quarters, even if they're locked in their rooms, they still have to be in that confined space.
Well, and they were engaged in extensive social interaction before the lockdowns came, before people realized there was a disease outbreak.
So we had that. I mean, essentially, that was an experiment. That was enough data, wasn't it? And we had
it was a perfect petri dish. Yep.
Perfect petri dish, and we blew it. Wow. Yep. Okay, so it really was a mass hysteria. We had Sweden doing the opposite. Thank God somebody had the guts to do that. So we do have someone that we can look at now and say, okay, this is how we should manage it if it ever happens again. But Ramesh, it's very hard to get past this idea.
By the way, is one of the major conclusions of this study that we're talking about. They make the point that public policy decisions should never be made in panic.
Yes.
In this case, we had existing plans, we had a century's worth of data and experience and science conveniently summarized in national plans, which we had in Australia, and in the WHO report, which was published as recently as September 2019. And we just threw it all out and panicked.
Yeah. More from our interview with Dr. Ramesh Thakur in a moment. Please remember to follow us on Twitter, now X, TikTok and Instagram at OthersideAus. That's AUS. And please smash the like, subscribe and every other button on all the platforms that you possibly can. And please make comments because that also helps with the magical algorithms that control us all. Of course, the best place to join us is on ADH TV at adh.tv on any web browser, and it's absolutely free. And then you get all our other great content: Fred Paul, Dave Flint, Alexandra Marshall, Daisy Cousins, Spectator TV, Nick Cater, Church and State with Dave Pello, and all the special events are up there too for you to watch on demand. Shocking revelations this week that young criminals are giving crimes different values on social media and are trying to outdo each other on social media to climb the criminal ladder. This was revealed in a special report in Brisbane's Courier Mail this week, centred around the state's most crime-riddled city, Townsville. The newspaper says it found dozens of Instagram pages, most with several videos like this one, and photos taken from inside stolen cars, speeding at almost lethal speeds and posing beside the cars like a prize. Townsville Detective Acting Inspector Dave Miles said police are aware of this phenomenon and it's even happening from within detention centres. He told the Courier Mail that if someone gets a particular car, then someone will want to get a better one. If someone wants to challenge police in a certain way, then they will ramp up the way that they challenge police. They will pursue police, ram police. Each thing for them gets a different rating as far as notoriety. Now, this is not just a bad thing. This is a serious deterioration of our criminal justice system. It needs a crisis-style response from governments all across Australia, not just badly managed Queensland. Crime is occurring and juvenile crime is out of control in places like Townsville because these kids think they are above the law. There are no consequences for their bad behaviour or even repeated bad behaviour. Government has only got a couple of things that it has to get right. It meddles in hundreds of other things that we'd be better off not having government meddle in. But there's one or two things that we have to have government for, and crime control is one of them. And they're failing at that thing that they're supposed to do because they're too damn busy telling law-abiding citizens what pronouns we're allowed to use and what we should think and do and feel and fining us with $1,000 fines. Get your act together, bureaucrats and politicians, and do your damn jobs. Crime and punishment is pretty easy. You punish criminals to disincentivize them. You don't punish the rest of us by locking down cities or imposing curfews. You punish and find the criminals. Just like in the old days, you hunt down the bad kids and punish them. Then they need to decide, using their own faculties of personal responsibility, whether to change their ways or keep on getting punished. I know there's lots of reasons why people offend. I know that we need to help kids reform. I know we need to support them to get on the straight and narrow. But they also have to cop their punishment. It's part of the healing and growing process. And we've been too lenient for way too long. So lenient that these kids are literally laughing in our faces on social media. They are mocking and threatening the police. Do you honestly think that the good men and women who become police officers are going to want to stay in their jobs if this is what they have to face? It's time to sack all the lefty criminologists and sociologists that work in our government bureaucracies. They have failed us. New research suggests that government lockdowns during COVID caused far more harm than good. In the second part of our interview this week, Australian National University professor and former United Nations Assistant Secretary General Dr. Ramesh Thakur explains how Australian governments were among the world's worst performers in this regard. Dr. Thakur says Australian authorities rushed to panic and they created a fear-based mass hysteria which seriously clouded the judgment of the public, the media, politicians and health officials, and led to massive health, social and economic damage that was completely unnecessary. Ramesh, we do hear stories though, and particularly in poorer countries. I mean, you know, from I guess from the South Asian perspective, you know, I know from some, you know, have Asian connection in East Asia. I heard a lot of my parents-in-law's friends in their 70s and 80s were dying. And they, you know, it seemed like there were a lot of elderly people dying from COVID. We had the horrible situations in the UK hospitals and the Italian hospitals and the, as I said, the Indian situation. There were people saying that in the United States the numbers were ridiculous because they weren't locking down. How much of that was hysteria? How much of that was true, do you think? And why were we getting that perception of chaos?
It was mostly hysteria. If you go to even New York at the peak of the worst time,
yeah,
there were some hospitals, for example, from the Navy hospital ship that was sent there, it was never used. The Nightingale hospitals that were set up in the UK, they were never used and they had to be dismantled. It's not unlike our camps that we created at great cost that were never in fact used. So a lot of it was hysteria. You're talking about the developing countries. I did an article for an African research institute where I said, if you take the petrol pump analogy of the meter for your fuel gauge that you're pumping into your car, if you had 3 or 4 items on a daily basis, COVID deaths, malaria deaths, TB deaths, AIDS deaths, COVID would not make the slightest impression on that. The other big killer diseases were there. And I said, what it shows is Europe has been hit, North America has been hit, South America has been hit. These were the 3 big outbreaks in the early months. Keep a watchful eye. It's not something to take lightly. And if things start to go bad, then in the meantime, prepare a surge capacity and then go into urgent crisis mode. But in the meantime, there is no need to panic. The big killer diseases are still these ones. And that remained true. It was never the number one killer disease, even in India. In April, May 2021, which is when all the horror stories came, it was not the number one killer disease, even in India.
Wow.
But because the media focused on that, using metrics and methodologies that were highly suspect. Remember how if you had tested positive for COVID within a month of coming into hospital, no matter what you died of, you had to be listed as a COVID death. Wow. But after vaccination, on the other hand, for 14 days after vaccination, officially on the record, you were still recorded as unvaccinated. So if you died of a vaccine injury, it would show up as an unvaccinated death.
I mean, this recording of every death as a COVID death just destroyed the data, as far as I was concerned. I mean, you couldn't trust any data. So how do you make decisions with terrible data?
It has had a longer-term, very bad impact, and we see that in poll after poll across the world now. People have lost trust and faith in governments, in the public health institutions, and in the media.
Definitely
and
the media.
So, again, some of us argued at the time, if you make vaccines mandatory, the long-term effect will be, it will promote cross-vaccine hesitancy. And most vaccines are extremely beneficial, particularly childhood immunization programs, especially in the developing world. And you're risking those for highly dubious results using dubious data at the moment. That's exactly what has happened.
Yes, now we'll have vaccine resistance.
Measles vaccine hesitancy is showing up.
Yep. So, you know, in the early days, I was hopeful of the vaccine would help. Obviously, everybody wanted a vaccine that would work and that would be helpful. But I was vehemently opposed and have always been vehemently opposed to the unethical abomination of imposing vaccination on people, mandating vaccination. And I have a very high bar for that. I don't even believe that if there's a if there's a pandemic, you can ask people to go and shut down and lock themselves in their room perhaps, but you cannot force them to inject something into their body. But we were dealing with, okay, mRNA technology had been around for a little while, but it was not applied in this manner ever before.
No. Well, let me say 3 or 4 things. Firstly, even the lockdown, the shutdowns, in effect, the governments imposed population-wide house arrests. Now, if I have not committed a crime and I'm not sick, I don't have any symptoms of sickness, then I do object to being put under house arrest. And I'd like to know why they're doing that. So I don't even accept that. With vaccines, early on, I think it would have made sense to say, we will make it available for free to everyone. We will recommend it to the elderly who are most vulnerable, and we will not mandate it for anyone.
We're speaking to Ramesh, Dr. Ramesh Thakur from the Australian National University and the Brownstone Institute. Ramesh, there were 3 news items that you addressed in your article in The Spectator recently. One of them, as you said, we don't know that the vaccine prevented anybody from being infected. It does not stop them from infecting other people. The one thing it was supposed to be able to do was stopping the severity of disease and the length of time of the duration of disease. Do we know any more about whether that even was achieved with the vaccine?
We do know. And again, we go back to the point about the age segregated impacts. For younger people who are healthy, the risk of dying from COVID or even the risk of serious injury or illness from COVID requiring hospitalization and ICU admission was very, very negligible. It was 1/10,000th as low as that of elderly people. On the other hand, the risk of collateral side effects that are harmful and seriously harmful is 20 to 60 times higher. So the cost-benefit ratio just doesn't work for young people. And therefore, requiring mandatory vaccination for example, university-age students, which is the one that we're talking about, just never made any sense, and yet most universities imposed it. Now, earlier this month, having last month said that for the incoming new students in the fall, in the northern fall this year, Harvard would still require vaccination. Earlier this month, they finally said, no, that will no longer be necessary. We would recommend it, but we're not going to require it. Given the position of Harvard in the world of higher education, I'm hoping that this will have a flow-on effect, and a lot of other universities will back off that. So that was the one hopeful news.
I mean, can Harvard afford any more hits to its reputation? I don't think so. They need to get their act together on a number of fronts pretty fast. All right. The other article was Pfizer advertising to recruit children essentially as big pharma lab rats. I mean, they really did play on parents' fears and, put pressure on parents to actually get their kids when they knew, there is evidence to suggest that they knew that they weren't 100% sure that this would even be of any benefit to children and that the risks were, could be serious.
Well, we didn't know because they were never part of the original trials. Children and pregnant women were not part of the original trials. By definition, we didn't have any long-term safety data. And the efficacy data that you referred to earlier showed effectiveness. The relative risk reduction was in the range of 95%. The absolute risk reduction was under 1% because most people were not at risk. So the children were never part of the trial. It should never have been authorized for children. I still don't accept any justification for authorizing it for pregnant people without the long-term safety studies. This is a new technology. It may be immensely beneficial down the line. But until the long-term studies are done, we just don't know. The precautionary principle actually technically means that we should have said no until we have the data, rather than go ahead and risk it.
Yeah, or at least run a trial, right? Rather than using the actual rollout as the trial. More of my interview with Dr. Thakur in a moment. I just want to let you know that next week we have a really special show for you as we step back from the news cycle for an episode and deep dive just a little to ask the question, is Australia in a cultural crisis? I'll be joined by two blokes who've got some very interesting takes on all of that, and it's quite a fascinating conversation. Be sure to join us. That special episode will first drop, as always, on ADH TV next Friday night at 8 p.m. Don't miss it. The tragic death of Australian aid worker Zomi Grantham and her colleagues in Israel is heartbreaking. The death of innocents in war zones is always disturbing, especially when it's people volunteering to be there to help out. As I've always said throughout this war, it's critical that we remember who started it: Hamas, a terrorist group that was the governing authority of the Palestinians in Gaza. Now, I'm not Jewish, I'm not Israeli, I'm not funded in any way by anyone who is. I'm not dumb. I think about things. I'm very informed about recent and longer history of the Middle East region, and I still support Israel because I support civilization. I don't support terrorism. October 7, 2023 was the day that I lost all sympathy for the Palestinian cause. And where's the rich Arab world right now? Why aren't they helping the Gazans more? Why is Egypt still not opening the border to their brothers and sisters in Islam? Liberal Party MP for the electorate of Flinders in Victoria, Zoe McKenzie, said this week that Australians should be very careful with our language regarding this latest tragedy. She says we've seen terrible anti-Israel and anti-Jewish statements in this country since October, and terrible acts of anti-Semitism. And she's rightly pointed out that the Israeli government is being held to a completely different standard from Hamas regarding breaches of humanitarian law. She's right. And Israel Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has made it clear he wants full Israeli security control of Palestinian territories, given the attacks on October 7. There's simply now no other way. The United Nations wants to democratically transition the region to Palestinian governance and sovereignty. But the Palestinians have decades of work to do to prove that they're capable of self-governance. They might like to start with a complete surrender of Hamas leadership, especially the guys still living in luxury in Qatar and other places around the world. And they could start by handing back all the hostages. Honestly, that anyone could still have any moral uncertainty about this war is astounding. Hamas launched an attack on Israel that was months in the planning, well coordinated to cause maximum impact, not just in terms of the number of people killed, but to strike fear in people's hearts by the level of vile barbarism, a true act of terrorism. It was an attack that was launched by air, sea and land. It indiscriminately killed women and children, and yet we still have people, mostly just leftist idiots and radical Islamists, marching in the streets, still, as if they have a moral leg to stand on. It's absolute pure madness. And the deaths of these aid workers, no matter how tragic and sad, doesn't change that reality one little bit. High levels of excess deaths remain in Australia and around the world in many countries, but new evidence suggests that the cause may be related to the long-term impacts of COVID mismanagement via lockdowns, not vaccine side effects as some experts have suspected. Excess mortality rates in Sweden, a country whose population is as COVID vaccinated as Australia and many others, are much lower. So this suggests the problem may be related to medium and long-term medical effects of mass lockdowns, which Sweden did not employ. In the third part of our pre-recorded discussion for this week's show, former UN Assistant General Secretary and ANU Professor Dr. Ramesh Thakur says an open and honest discussion and formal inquiries with wide terms of reference are now needed to truly understand the mistakes of the COVID era and what we must learn so as not to repeat them in the future. Excess deaths, where are we at now in Australia? It's been a while since we covered out on this on the show, but
Well, I looked at it, the most recent ABS data on that published last month, and the new one will come out at the end of March, covers the period January to November 2023 inclusive. And they show an excess death rate of just over 15,000. I think it's 15,114. If I have my memory, it's certainly over 15,000, but that might be the exact number, which equates to 10.0% compared to the baseline, which is an average of, I think they might be using 3 years rather than 5 years. But whatever it is, excess deaths continue to be a problem. And if you combine that with Sweden, the low excess mortality in Sweden, that's very interesting because Sweden, of course, is a highly vaccinated country. So what this suggests is that more than vaccination, or rather than vaccination, it may be the longer term lockdown impacts that are still proving very damaging. The missed consultations, the damage to mental health, the developmental damage for young children, the school closures, the depressions and mental health crises, all these are showing up, and the missed screenings and tests that were put aside because we thought COVID was going to kill everyone. We ignored the others.
Okay, so let's be really clear on that, because a lot of people will this excess death thing, you're saying there that Sweden had almost no excess deaths or far lower excess deaths than a lot of other countries, including Australia. Yet they had a high vaccination rate, or as high a vaccination rate voluntarily as we did with our mandate. Okay, so it's not possibly then the vaccination that's causing the excess deaths, or all of them. We know out of that 15,000, about 9,000 can be explained. There's a little margin of error, but you're still talking about 4, 5, 6,000 deaths that we cannot explain. That's an extraordinary number.
It is. So what we need to do is put aside preconceptions from all sides.
Yeah.
And look at this seriously. You know, at the time we said from an abundance of caution, we're going to do this because even one avoidable death is one death too many. Well, okay, now we have 15,000. So what is the mix of causes and effects that are producing this? Why are we so, why do we lack any curiosity about finding out what's driving that and what we can do about it? That's what we need to do, examine, set up a credible and qualified team to look at it all and make recommendations. And that if that means saying we made mistakes and these are long-term impacts, accept that and prepare better for the next time.
Well, this is where I think our leaders and our media stand condemned for the way that they handled things in 2020-21, because it's incumbent upon the people that we elect to lead us, the adults in the room, to stand up, take responsibility, show the leadership and the intellect to think more in a more complex way rather than a super simplistic reactive way. And not only that, I believe that they just played politics. They just hid behind. I think the setting up of the National Cabinet was an attempt of the federal government to shift blame to the states. I think all of the state premiers abdicated responsibility when they shifted responsibility to their CHOs and dumped it on the medical administrators. And then we saw the passing on of the buck there to others. It just never stopped. Nobody took ownership. Nobody took responsibility, and nobody led with the intellect to say to people, look, we have to look at these things in a complex way. There are many variables here, and we have to think clearly through them, and we have to be patient. It just didn't happen.
It's part of our duty of care to the people of Australia that we examine what's going on and we come up with honest answers. It goes with the territory. If you're not prepared to do that, you should not even aspire to public office, let alone be in the cabinet positions or be the premier or prime minister of state and country. But what the price is, what exactly the causes were, and pathways were to lead to this, and how we avoid this in the future. These are the important questions that need to be addressed, and the official inquiry that the Prime Minister has set up is not even going to address them. So that's going to be a complete farce.
Also, the UK inquiry has been a little bit of a farce too, Ramesh.
Little bit is an
Yeah.
understatement.
Yeah. So we're not getting to the truth. The same gameplay is going on. They don't want the answers because the answers will lead to people having to take responsibility, and that scares the living daylights out of them, no doubt.
In the UK inquiry, what we have found out, which is interesting, is when it moved to Scotland and Wales, then we have had confirmed that they adopted certain COVID policies just to show themselves to be different from England, without any basis in science.
Things like that seem to be common sense, like masking, social distancing, even lockdowns to a certain extent. The intuitive part of us says, yeah, that should work, right? That should stop the spread. Are you saying that that the evidence is that it didn't at all?
It's worse than that. I'm sorry, Damian. It was actually counterproductive, and common sense will tell you why.
Oh, no, I appreciate that it's counterproductive. I appreciate it had all sorts of side effects, and we should never have done it on a cost benefit.
No, not side effects. Not side effects. On its own terms, it was counterproductive. The most common site of transmission was the household.
Oh.
If a family living together, a family of 6, let's say, instead of spending 8 hours in the house, spent 8 hours outside in the park and on the beach in the sunshine in Australia, fewer people would have been infected, fewer would have died of COVID. So even on its own terms, it was counterproductive.
Even if we were mixing with each other, even if people were mixing with other people.
Yeah.
Wow.
Because it's an outgrowth. At one point in the mid-21, I remember a New York Times story that there has not been a single documented case of a COVID infection contracted outdoors.
It didn't take much for us to throw away our liberties, and I hope those Australians that did throw away their liberties and who leapt to being the greatest job artists in history are feeling truly, truly ashamed of themselves now and are deeply reflecting on the errors that they made and apologising to the people that they hurt and upset, and will commit to not doing this ever again. It really was a failure of our society. You're not seeing that much. Not seeing a lot of remorse.
I think they will justify it by saying we meant well, and that excuse.
Yeah, that's right. The final segment of my interview with Dr. Ramesh Thakur in a moment. But first, one of my favourite stories this week was the utter hypocrisy shown by the Prime Minister and his Energy and Climate Change Minister, Chris Bowen, as they took 2 separate jets to an event on, wait for it, National Vehicle Energy Efficiency. Channel 7 reported on it this way.
Anthony Albanese, the Climate Change Minister and Industry Minister, under fire for taking 2 RAAF jets to this renewable energy announcement.
There was actually like a 6:45 direct Canberra to Newcastle link flight for $200. Outrageous.
They left Canberra for Scone last Thursday, less than half an hour apart.
As you know, the Prime Minister always travels with the Royal Australian Air Force. All Prime Ministers have for living memory. The runway at Scone wasn't strong enough to take the large jets, so the Air Force recommended and took the decision for 2 small jets.
Yeah, nothing to see here, folks. What's the matter with you? Channel 7's Isabel Mullen reporting there, and she tied the story quite rightly to the drop in support for the government in the polls this week among young people.
Down 5 points, the coalition gaining ground. Labor still ahead overall on a 2-party preferred split.
And that's for voters aged 18 to 34, the young who usually overwhelmingly back Labor. So why was the PM even at that vehicle charging station event? Isn't this Chris Bowen's baby? Well, some have speculated that the PM wanted to bask in a little of the limelight, the great virtue signalling limelight that the kiddies love so much when it comes to charging stations and electric vehicles, and take a little of the shine off Chris Bowen. So he tagged along in his own jet. Nice. All that carbon emitted for the sake of a bit of good PR. Now, I don't really give a rat's. I think the Prime Minister should be able to fly anywhere he wants in the country at any time he wants. It should be a right that comes with the top job, and it's needed for security reasons, of course. In the US, the President gets a huge passenger plane, Air Force One. Bowen and the rest of them could have taken the commercial flight. But even an occasional Air Force jet for them is fine too. The problem here is the hypocrisy and the idiotic moral grandstanding that we all have to put up with about climate being such a crisis. Well, it's not so much of a crisis that we can't fly a couple of jets. And it's not so much of a crisis that we can't ban nuclear power. So just how much of a crisis are we supposed to believe it is, really? A new UK poll published in London's The Telegraph newspaper says 1/3 of scientists believe that government officials focused only on a minority of opinions in managing the COVID response, wrongly equating healthy scientific skepticism with science denialism. In the final segment of my interview for this week's episode with Dr. Ramesh Thakur from the Australian National University, we discuss how the media and social media censorship created a false sense that skeptical scientists were vastly outnumbered by others when they were not. He says this caused them to self-censor and not speak out to question the majority, which had serious negative effects being felt even today. Dr. Thakur says the scientific community must understand this error and work to ensure it doesn't happen again. Ramesh, one final report that we didn't mention was the poll data from the UK. This was a wide-ranging survey conducted by the Telegraph newspaper and Census Wide and published in March that found that 33%, 1/3 of scientists believe that officials had focused only on a minority of opinions. I love this line, wrongly equating scientific skepticism with scientific denialism. In other words, accusing people of being scientific deniers when in actual fact we were just being healthily skeptical.
Yep.
Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because it ties in with two other things that are important to remember. But as a premise, science is never settled. It's not an encyclopedia of accumulated facts. It's always work in progress. If scientists did not question existing consensus, we would never have any progress. We would still all be literally believers in a flat earth. So people who question and are skeptical are the ones who drive progress. Not all turn out to be right, but it's important to remember that.
Absolutely.
And that means they must have the freedom to be able to do it. But what happened was, this brings in the censorship industrial complex and the use of media and social media and big tech to impose and enforce the censorship. As a result of which people who were skeptical never realized the extent of support they had amongst fellow scientists. They were deplatformed, they were not allowed to communicate, and they were demonized and vilified. And in many cases, the relevant regulatory authorities and colleges of medical associations, etc., came down hard on them as well. And so they feared loss of patronage, they feared loss of research grants, avenues for publication were shut down to them, which had severe career impacts. And most people, therefore, kept their heads below the parapet.
Unbelievable.
It's unfortunate because I think, as I said in the article, there was a contagion of cowardice and complicity by the media as well. If they had spoken out, if they had defied it, all you need is up to 10% of all doctors saying, no, we do not agree with the official line. We think there's cause for further investigation. And in the meantime, we prefer to leave this to the doctor and patient in the privacy and confidentiality of the clinic, and it's for them to decide based on informed consent. No mandatory coercion by anyone. That would have collapsed. The narrative would have collapsed. And we would have had overall better health outcomes, even on COVID, I believe. Instead,
Same thing happened with journalists, Ramesh. Same thing happened in newsrooms, right? People were afraid to speak out. Adam Crichton from The Australian was one of the few. And he, I think you mentioned in your article, he faulted a too credulous, incurious mainstream media, naive to the political and financial forces that push governments to assume the more sensible path of voluntary COVID-19 vaccination. And he was hammered for it. He was criticised and slammed from all sides. And
he had to change his phone number, if I remember right. I think he was subjected to all sorts of things. I think the one magazine, as it happens, that stood out in the world in this sense was The Spectator Australia. and more kudos to them.
But I do think it doesn't help when you've got a $1 billion+ funded government media machine sitting in the middle of the media in Australia, feeding out the propaganda of the state and the line of the state with very little criticism.
Well,
very little
just
critique.
one final comment on that, which goes beyond what I said in the article, and that is that what we see across the Western world is essentially a split between the elites and the ordinary people. And the elites based in the metropolitan cities and including the educational, cultural, legal, etc. We saw that with The Voice, and other people out in the country, if you like, in Australia, the Highlands land. And the elites are in many respects waging a war on their own people and losing. The most recent example, the twin referendum in Ireland, the farmers' revolt in Europe on net zero, the election of right of centre parties in Italy, Netherlands, possibly coming up in Germany, most recently in Portugal. So I think there is a pushback now. And what COVID did do was, once the trust in institutions fell away, many more people are now starting to look more critically and skeptically at other items on the agenda, including climate change and net zero. So it's interesting. I don't know if you've seen the new movie, Climate, a movie. I forget who it's done by, but it's got a lot of serious people. It's more than an hour long. A lot of well-credentialed, serious people pointing out, going back to conspiracy theories, pointing out that there's been a silence, that this 97% scientific consensus thing is a myth, and a manufactured myth, deliberately created myth.
Well, this is the thing. I mean, modelling mistaken for scientific research was, I think, the line you used in the article, right? Mm-hmm. This is modelling, scientific modelling, and people look at the modelling and go, whoa, that's the reality. That's the scientific fact, that modelling.
Yeah, exactly.
That's where the temperature's going to go. That's where the number of deaths. If you look at the modelling from COVID early on, it was completely wrong on many levels. And there's a lot to be said for the fact that the modelling on climate and temperature increase is potentially very, questionable. And yet we're not even having that discussion anymore. We've passed that. We've moved beyond that now. It's just accepted. Now we can't even get people to agree to a free market of different energy options. So that's a whole other story. Ramesh, we are out of time. I could talk to you all day. Wonderful to speak to you. Great to have you on the show. Will you come back again sometime?
We'll look forward to that. Thanks, Damian.
Thanks very much for your time. Dr. Ramesh Thakur there on the other side. And that is all we have time for this week on The Other Side Australia. We have a really special show for you next week as we step back from the news cycle for one episode and we deep dive a little bit. We're going to look at the question of, is Australia in a cultural crisis? I'm going to be joined by two very smart guests that we've had on the show previously. It's going to be a fantastic discussion. Make sure you do join us. That'll drop on ADH TV first, as always. First on ADH TV every Friday night at 8 p.m. We'll see you next week. Take care. Have a good one.